Director General for ParlAmericas, Alicia Todd. We are pleased to be coordinating this program with our colleagues from UNDRR, WFP, and UN Women. But without further ado, I'd really rather just pass it on to the Vice President of ParlAmericas, Speaker Bridgid Annisette-George from the House of Representatives of Trinidad and Tobago. Madam Vice President, I pass the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Director General, and good afternoon to everyone. Greetings from ParlAmericas. It's a pleasure to be able to give a start to this very important meeting and to formally welcome you and thank you for your attendance today. On behalf of ParlAmericas, I would also like to give special thanks to our partners for this meeting for sharing their valuable expertise with us all. The UNDRR Regional Office for the Americas and the Caribbean, the UN Women Multicultural Office for the Caribbean, and the World Food Program Multi-Country Office for the Caribbean. Without them, this meeting would not be possible, and we encourage you to leverage the open dialogue opportunities to ask any questions you may have and to draw on their expertise. This year, experts have warned that we will experience above hurricane activity, a threat that came a reality with Hurricane Beryl. The impacts of climate change are being increasingly felt in our region every year through floods, droughts, and landslides. And I don't know about you all, but last week in Trinidad and Tobago, and I would say up to Monday of this week, the heat was unbearable. We are also often being impacted by multiple hazards simultaneously, coupled with varied physical and social vulnerabilities. These hazards can greatly threaten lives, livelihoods, and the environment. For these reasons, today's meeting is of great importance to help deepen our understanding of the critical role parliaments play in various dimensions of reducing disaster risk and building resilience. One key theme of the session will be supporting the implementation of multi-hazard early warning systems with an intersectional perspective that benefits everyone. These systems have been gaining prominence in the Caribbean, but as parliamentarians, we can ensure their adoption and strengthening in our countries. As representatives of our constituencies, we can also help with the effective communication of these urgent warnings to our citizens that we represent. We will also examine how we can contribute to more gender-responsive disaster risk reduction strategies that enable all communities, especially vulnerable communities, to receive timely and adequate support during and after disasters. Finally, we will explore ways to improve the resiliency of communities and infrastructure to withstand and recover from disasters, how parliaments can help ensure there is adequate investment in disaster risk management and policy measures that enhance adaptive capacities, which all allow essential services to remain open even when disasters occur. And I wish to share a bit about what we have done and we continue to do in Trinidad and Tobago. So we have an Office of Disaster Management Preparedness, and in our 2024 budget, which the cycle will come to an end in about another 2 or 3 weeks, well, no, the end of this month, which is next Monday, we allocated $17 million for the operations of the Office of Disaster Management Preparedness. And our Parliament, through its oversight rule, has been for the last 2 parliaments, the 11th and the current 12th, been through our joint select committees, been looking at disaster risk reduction and preparedness. so that in our session of our last, our session ending September 2020, our Joint Select Committee on Land and Physical Infrastructure entered an inquiry into flood alleviation and control measures for major river basins and drainage catchments in Trinidad and Tobago, subjected to major flooding over the past years. And in that inquiry, our findings covered things like drainage infrastructure in Trinidad and Tobago, which we found was generally aged and not sized to accommodate current rainfall patterns. Additionally, we found that pump and gate infrastructure were obsolete and could no longer be maintained or withstand the current rainfall patterns. And therefore, the recommendation coming out of that was that finding was an assessment be undertaken to determine the effectiveness of current flood management legislation in relation to flood management by the Ministry of Planning and Development, given its responsibility for planning. That assessment, we recommended, should identify areas for improvement and be submitted to Parliament 6 months subsequent to the laying of the report. Also found that there is need to assess the capacity of drainage infrastructure to determine its adequacy to convey flows estimated from new rainfall data. Recommendation was that a comprehensive flood management act be passed to incorporate all the various responsibilities for flood management, including areas for improvement. Another finding was that the Water Resources Agency flood early warning system will provide real-time flood alerts, thereby preparing citizens for impending floods so that necessary action can be taken to mitigate the risks associated with flooding. And one of our recommendations was that there should be provision for a flood control project implementation plan to be updated every 5 years and included in the comprehensive flood management legislation. We also recommended that there be included in the comprehensive flood management legislation, there should be strict penalties for breaches and stringent enforcement methods. We also recommended that our Ministry of Works and Transport consult with our Ministry of Public Utilities regarding the provision for stormwater management and drainage control measures in this comprehensive draft national IWRM policy, and to avoid, so that there will be avoidance of the depletion of resources. One thing with our committee systems and our recommendations is that our various committees follow up on the recommendations. The follow-up involves there being a response by the government within 60 days of recommendations and continuous follow-up to see what these responses to the recommendations are. The other thing we've done is that our Joint Select Committee, which is our Public Administration and Appropriation Committee, which examines our real-time expenditure, in its 12th report in our 4th session, we held also an inquiry into the issue of disaster management systems. And the hope was to look to see how this is coordinated to result in a robust disaster risk reduction at the local government level. We looked at what the disaster management system looks like. We also looked at our national response framework regarding disaster risk reduction, which was updated to accord with the United Nations Sendai Framework 2015-2030, and that has specific focus on 4 priority areas. Priority one, understanding disaster risk. Priority two, strengthen disaster risk governance to manage disaster risk. Priority three, investing in disaster risk reduction resilience. And priority four, enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response and to build back better in recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. And therefore, we look to see how Trinidad and Tobago has adopted and adhered to the following policies of comprehensive disaster management policy framework at the national level, critical facilities policy framework 2020 at the national level, and also looking at the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency's guiding document 2014-2024 at the regional level. And therefore, in this inquiry that we had made specific findings regarding things like how the green economy would help in disaster risk reduction. And although we didn't have specific recommendations, we continue to look as a joint select committee into how the budget is being applied to disaster risk reduction and disaster risk management. We also have an ongoing inquiry, which is being done by our Joint Select Committee on Local Authorities, Service Commission, and Statutory Authorities. And that is examining the efficiency and effectiveness of the municipal corporations in responding to natural disasters, with specific focus on the collaborative arrangements which has been established between the Office of Disaster Management, Preparedness, and other relevant state entities. This is ongoing. There has not been any report as yet. So in our parliament, we look at both looking to see how best within our budgetary confines we can support the operations of the Office of Disaster Preparedness and Management, and also how we resource our local government agencies, including we have in Trinidad 14 local government municipalities. They are first responders in disaster risks, in any disaster and in the management of disaster. So we look to see how best we can resource them to meet the needs of our people. To say this, that we end our budget cycle on the 30th, and therefore we go into our budget cycle in looking at making budgetary allocations. That takes the entire month of October. Again, in terms of preparing our new budget for the 2024-2025 budgetary cycle, the national budget. And of course, one of the areas of great focus for our parliament, and also in the debate and the Standing Finance Committee, is this issue of disaster risk reduction and disaster risk management. And therefore, I move on to look at the issue of our resources, and to remind members that ParlAmericas provides a lot of resources, but 2 resources in particular are of relevance for this discussion. And the first resource is the ParlAmericas Parliamentary Protocol for Disaster Risk Reduction and Climate Change Adaptation, which was developed in collaboration with the UNDRR and which seeks to guide parliamentary work to support the legislative branch's contributions to the implementation of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. And it provides tools for parliaments to align parliamentary functions with the framework's 4 principles, which I had outlined before: understanding, governance, financing, and preparation. And the second resource is a primer on gender-responsive disaster planning in the Caribbean, which raises awareness on the differentiated impacts disasters and crises can have on different groups of women, men, girls, and boys, and how best to respond to and to accommodate these distinct needs. These resources, of course, are available on ParlAmericas website. And in closing, I say this, that we know that we as parliamentarians have vital responsibilities in national disaster risk reduction through oversight of the government's disaster risk reduction plans and engaging on this theme with public and approving national budgets that address community needs and in establishing effective regulatory frameworks. I am eager, and I guess so are you, to engage with the collective body today and our experts to learn from the insights and good practices to be shared and how best we can contribute in these areas. I thank you all, and I wish us all a very fruitful engagement.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Colleagues, just to follow up quickly on that, the resources, as Speaker Annisette-George has mentioned, are on our website, but we also shared them in the chat too for you there if you wanted to have access to what are those publications that we are resources that we developed jointly with partners here in this room. Moving right along into our agenda, although before we do so, Madam Speaker, come back, because I do this part where I'm asking you to turn on your camera.
I'm right here, just very cool.
Okay. But if you can turn on your camera, because it's the photo time, and we do want a family photo if that's possible before we move into the agenda. So I encourage all to turn on their cameras. Nice big smiles. Come on, my other colleagues. I know you're there. We'll give you a moment. Please join us. This will be shared out with all of you too later. Oh, Speaker Ford, so nice to see you today. Thank you for being here. Look, this is the part two. We can see everyone here. I wish I could be with you all in beautiful Caribbean. I'm calling, and it's a cold day in Ottawa. I'm just telling you this. This exchange between Ottawa and the Caribbean, you're giving me your warmth. The smiling faces, bringing the warmth. It's cold. We're starting into our fall. All right, everybody's got their camera on, big smiles. And so we'll just get a picture. Thank you so much for indulging. They give you this fun job. This is wonderful. And then we'll move right into the program here because I know you're all very, very busy. We got the picture? Yes? All right, I got a thumbs up from the team. It gives me great pleasure to now move into the agenda. We're very delighted here to have with us Senator, the Honourable Dr. Erasia Hepburn Forbes from the Bahamas, who will actually do the heavy lift here. It's not for Alicia to continue talking. I get to hand it off to the doctor. Bahamian senator, an assistant professor of biology at the University of the Bahamas, with a PhD in agriculture, applied economics, and policy studies. She has a strong background in education, sustainable development, and leadership. She has served as president of the Bahamas Agricultural and Marine Science Institute, advisor to the Bahamas Red Cross, and consultant for the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. Dr. Hepburn Forbes is dedicated to environmental conservation and community well-being, making her a passionate educator, consultant, and leader. And I had the great experience of working with Senator in Antigua and Barbuda, and I know that she is also an incredibly skilled moderator. So, Senator, I pass the floor to you to take us into our program here. Thank you for being here with us today.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I actually have the terrific task. Please let me know if you could hear me. Are we good? Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you
because I was
perfectly.
having some technical difficulties earlier. But I have the terrific task of being your moderator today. And I think that this is about to be an exciting session. When I look up the lineup, one of the things I have to do is to just give the session objectives, introduce our two speakers, and then go into the question and answer period. So I'll start right off with my task and giving the session objectives. This session will feature expert presentations, which will provide recommendations for parliamentary interventions that can enhance disaster prevention and response. Additionally, this segment will address specific questions and concerns expressed by parliaments, offering practical solutions and strategies. So we know what this means. These sessions are going to give us expert opinions so we could come up with answers that benefits all of our countries. We have two guest speakers, and I'll introduce them both and then turn it over. Well, I think I'll do one by one and let them do their session and then come back in and do the second person. So for our first session, we have Speaker Jer Torres. Please tell me if I pronounce your name correctly. And he is from the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction to discuss multi-hazard early warning systems, perspectives on sustainable and inclusive governance. So Jer is a program manager officer at the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction on the Americas and Caribbean. He holds a PhD in risk and emergency management and has extensive experience providing consultancy services to various international organizations, different governments worldwide. His work focuses on disaster risk reduction, school safety, early warning systems, scientific cooperation, with significant contributions to the development of national strategies and international platforms for disaster resilience. I know I don't want everybody to unmute their mics, but we could use the clapping symbol or raise hand to give Mr. Torres a round of applause as he comes to speak. Let's see those symbols show up there. Okay, can I turn over to Mr. Torres now?
Thank you, Honorable Senator. For me, it's a pleasure to be here and to really introduce the subject of multi-hazard early warning systems in the concept of the early warning for all initiative. So I'm gonna start my presentation. I will share my screen. So today, really, it's an honor to be with you here on this meeting. I'm going to be talking about the multi-hazard early warning systems and the perspectives on sustainable and inclusive governance. So really trying to highlight the role that you as a parliamentarians will have to play or can really play in order to ensure that these early warning systems are operational, fully financed, we have clear roles and responsibilities, etc., etc. So in order to start with this presentation, I would like first to mention that the Early Warning for All initiative is an initiative that was launched by the Secretary General 2 years ago on 23 March of 2022 in the International Day of the Meteorology, and with the clear ambition to ensure that everybody on air will be protected by early warning systems within 5 years. So that means by the end of 2027. And this notably linked to the whole international agenda that all of our countries has committed to develop, notably the Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, and the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, 3 of the agendas that were adopted on 2025 and that will go to 2030. So this is not, it's not that we started working on multi-hazard early warning systems just with the early warning for all, but it's just to mention that the Secretary General has really valued the role that disaster risk reduction and multi-hazard early warning systems can play on really building more resilient societies and building a more resilient world. And why he is taking this initiative as a flagship project or initiative in the coming years. Not only because disaster risk reduction is a highly cost-effective measure. It helps really to protect human lives and really to prevent economic damage and really can save recovery costs in a high percent. We estimate together with WMO that annual investments of $6 billion in disaster risk reductions worldwide could generate total risk reductions in the world about $360 billion, which is really a considerable amount of money that we can be saving and using the money that we use on response, on recovery, on reconstruction, on specific elements and targets that we have, for instance, on the Sustainable Development Goals, such as reducing poverty, increasing quality education, ensuring health, etc., etc. We also know that countries that has a multi-hazard early warning systems coverage, they have 6 to 8 times to lower the mortality and 5 times to lower the disaster, the people that is affected for the disaster. We also know that a 24-hour alert can reduce economic losses by 30%, and that there is a direct correlation between the investments that countries do on multi-hazard early warning systems and the advancements of those countries on the sustainable development goals and in general in sustainable development. So we also know that there is a value proposition, you know, that having a regional and as well a national early warning systems will reduce morbidity, will reduce assistance costs, and will improve the productivity of the country. So this has really facts that has been verified. The historical evidence has let us know this. We know as well that there is very cost-effective multi-hazard early warning systems concerning these investments that we do. The Global Commission on Adaptation report of 2019 listed the strengthening of early warning systems and one of the most benefits investments that countries can have, you know, even about making new infrastructure resilience, protecting mangrove, or other adaptive measures that the countries can have on this. So we see why there is this value of the Secretary General on ensuring that multi-hazard early warning systems are in place in all of the countries and that benefit all of the people in the world, started from the real far communities in all of our countries. But in order to try to get to the topic of multi-hazard early warning systems, I would like to start trying to see the differentiation about a narrower understanding of these systems and a wider understanding of multi-hazard early warning systems. So we have passed from the 80s and 90s and even at the beginning of this century with a really technical perspective about what multi-hazard early warning systems are. And we were really thinking early warning systems only as the technical equipment that would allow us to detect and forecast a hazard in order to send the parameters for decision-making authorities. So it was really related to the technical issues. Nevertheless, with the pass of the years and the different unfortunate disasters that we have been having all around the world, we know that early warning systems are not only about the technical aspects that we need to check on early warning systems, but it's also about the social process that really embedded those technical components in social context. So we know that we can have the best monitoring system, we can have the best early warning systems, but if that early warning systems doesn't trigger anticipatory action, and if it doesn't have a gender transformative approach, or if it doesn't have an inclusive approach that really ensure that people can take actions, it doesn't matter their condition, it doesn't matter if they are poor, rich, or it doesn't matter where they are located, early warning systems are not effective. It's like to have a Ferrari, but not having a highway where you can drive that beautiful car. And this is why we believe that early warning systems should pass from the technical perspective to more a social process that are incorporated in the social context. That is the DRM approach. And when we talk about multi-hazard early warning systems, we are talking notably about 5 main components here. The first one is about disaster risk knowledge, so really to understand what are the kind of hazards that we are exposed, what are the level of vulnerabilities that we have to that hazards, and trying to understand how those hazards will act, what are the behavior of hazards, what will be the intensity, the frequency, the locations, trying to understand better how these hazards can create any impact on our societies. If we know that we have a specific hazards on which one we are exposed, then comes the second pillar, that is really to ensure that we can detect when that hazards can trigger a disaster, because hazards not trigger disasters naturally. We can see, and this is why we also mentioned that disasters are not natural. You know, this conception of natural disaster really is for the 20th century, not for the 21st century. Similarly, if we are exposed to this, we really need to know how we can observe and monitor that hazards and try to understand where they can really become a disaster or can trigger impacts on that. The third component is the warning, dissemination, and communication. Let's say it's how, when we know that threshold will be passed by the hazard, so how we inform our communities in a way that is redundant to everybody by all of the channels, leaving no one behind, ensuring that we can use technology, but also traditional ways to communicate people in order that people can take actions. That is, at the end, the four specific pillars of this: how we prepare and how we ensure that the response capabilities are there in order that people can take actions, that if they need to evacuate, they have the capacities to evacuate. If they need to get specific funding, they have, impact-based financing and some resources in order that they can buy the water to stock, etc., etc. And not only people. Here we are talking about people, we are talking about institutions, we are talking about private sector, and we are talking about communities, so that everybody will be prepared and have the capacities to prepare. And there is what we call the +1 pillar, that is the pillar that is the most convenient for our conversation today. That is the governance pillars. Each of these pillars integrate internally a governance mechanisms, how we governance the risk knowledge in the country, how we governance the detection and observation, how we governance the warning, dissemination, and communication, and how we governance the preparedness and response, but as well how we governance the whole elements of the multi-hazard early warning system. Who is responsible for what? How we're gonna sustain the operation of those systems? How we're gonna create the different strategies in order to ensure that they are inclusive, that they are gender responsive, etc. So as I mentioned, the governance is the element that will allow us to have really an early action, and that will bring all of the pillars together in order to ensure that we have the systems operational and effective. Just a small clarifications, when we are talking about multi-hazard early warning systems, sorry that I guess that I missed the, now you see, when we are talking about multi-hazard early warning systems, we are not talking about a single system that covers all of the hazards, and sometimes we have that confusion when we are talking with different stakeholders. When we are talking here is about really ensuring a coordinated approach that involves multiple disciplines in order to update and accurate hazards and identify and monitoring the different multiple exposure hazards. And why I'm saying these kind of things? Because one hazard can trigger another one. As we know, for instance, earthquakes can trigger tsunamis. So we really need to talk, we really need to ensure that those people that are in charge of monitoring, but also responding to earthquakes, really discuss with those of the coastal management units that monitor and really implement tsunamis. But also hazards compound each other. This is something that, for instance, we saw in St. Vincent and the Grenadines on 2019, 2020, 2021, when they were facing the epidemic of dengue. Then we started with the COVID-19, and then we have the volcano eruption, and then we have Hurricane Elsa impacted St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So we really need to have clear frameworks, standard operation procedures that let us know what to do in the case that something is happening when we are in a particular crisis. And that was very interesting to understand. For instance, in the case of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, when we have a special standard operational protocols or practice that tell us that in the case of a hurricane, we have to put people in shelter. But at the same time, we have other directives that say, like, we are in the middle of the pandemic, I cannot put people in shelter, or I have to put it in a different regulation. So this is when we are talking about multi-hazard, is trying to understand all of the connections that exist between the different hazards and the different impacts that each of them can cause on our society. So as I mentioned, this is an example of Guatemala, on which one we try to map all of the actors that are providing the different elements for early warning systems. So regulatory guidance, technical support, capacity development, implementation, financial, either coming from institutional organizations, national organizations, or from external aid like the donor support. So I'm coming now to the main elements that in my last 3 slides about how parliamentarians can really support the adoption and strengthening of multi-hazard early warning systems. So the first one, and it's not going to be something new for you, is concerning legislation. We really need clear legislation on multi-hazard early warning systems that define roles and responsibilities, including those financial responsibilities about from where the money will come, for instance, to the meteorological agencies, to the national disaster risk management organizations, to the social protection systems that would allow us to have mechanisms like those that we use in an ad hoc manner during the COVID, and that are covering all government institutions, but as well key stakeholders in the country, for instance, the private sector and other ones. And really, the legislation should really try to provide multi-hazard and multi-sectorial strategies in order to implement that. One of the examples that we have of this is the case of Barbados, that has approved recently his multi-hazard early warning systems policy, really trying to tackle all of these elements about role responsibilities, sustainability, who is responsible, who will provide the alert, who will provide information about the potential impacts that the hazard will have. And that is very important, that we have a clear understanding of who is responsible for what. And parliamentarians play a big role on this specific issue in order to assess the policies, implement the policies, and of course legislate that specific policies. And as well, not only on new policies, but on existing policies. Sometimes there are some countries that say, like, look, I have already a disaster risk reduction policy. Why to create a multi-hazard early warning systems policy? I just want to be sure that multi-hazard early warning systems, role responsibility, sustainability are included on my disaster risk reduction policy. So there are different mechanisms on which one we can ensure, but legislation is something that is very important. If we don't have legislation for early warning systems, we will continue having early warning systems based on project based and not on a programmatic priority for countries. And we have seen the benefits of these systems. So better legislate in order that we can have and take advantage of the benefits that early warning systems can have. The second strong support that parliamentarians can bring to multi-hazard early warning systems is on the oversee elements that you play. So really to ensure that all parliamentarian oversight functions and activities incorporate disaster risk reduction and risk-informed decisions while providing access to comprehensive information presented in a standardized and consistent format. So really ensure that in the functions that you have of control, you really see for those responsibles or for that individuals or institutions that should be working on the operation of the early warning systems and provide political debates. Why this didn't work? Why did it work? How is the budget going for this? When is when we're going to ensure that all of the population is covered? All of the elements that from the parliamentarians is necessary for political control, not only to the government, but also to the national institutions that are in charge of the implementation of these specific systems. Another point is on budget and finance. So in the development of financial strategies and financial instruments, parliamentarians can play an important role on develop those instruments and ensuring that we include on those strategies funds for the full operation of the systems, for data collection and sharing. There is elements, for instance, when we were talking about the roles and responsibility, one of the big issues that we have at the national levels is sharing data. How different ministers are producing or national institutions are producing data, but they are not sharing it at the national level. And that lack of sharing or protocols for sharing information is limiting our capacity to really foresee and forecast impacts, because information that a minister, for instance, of education is providing will provide a lot of critical information to the National Disaster Management Organization to better understand how a specific hazard can impact schools in a specific region, or what are the population of that school that can be impacted, and what are the actions that need to be differentiated to ensure that we leave no one behind. Also on the reporting and regulation enforcement of that budget and finance, and as well that we have budget and finance to really ensure the anticipatory actions. This at all levels of the government, including the scientific institutions that will provide the information for this, like the Met Office, the geological surveys, etc. As well, we will need to ensure that we integrate and mainstream multi-hazard early warning systems and DRR into public and private investments. So also parliamentarians can be very positive on really creating incentive for the private sector to ensure disaster risk reduction actions, not only on early warning systems, but for instance, creating incentive for them for retrofitting buildings, but also creating incentives for them to really support the way how the early warning systems can be more effective. For instance, incentives to the aviation sector that provide a lot of support to meteorological agencies in calibrating their models for having better forecasting, how we can provide more incentives in order that the aviation sector can provide more and more current and maintain support to the Met Office in order to ensure that we have better forecasting in our countries. The fourth point on which one parliamentarians can support is on the representation. So we really need to ensure that all of these people that you are representing really is represented on the policy and on the implementation of this early warning system. So really promoting inclusion, as I have mentioned before, that we leave no one behind, ensuring that the policy that we are doing and that the early warning systems that we are implementing in our countries provide a gender transformative and responsive approach that really leave no one behind in terms of elderly, child, or other populations that can be considered minorities in our countries. Really ensure that we are inclusive in the way about how these systems will leave no one behind. And as well, how we can represent, and foster the development of multi-sectorial, scientific, academic, and technical agencies and institutions to provide knowledge and advice on the innovation of these early warning systems. So how these scientific institutions can be represented in the parliament in order to ensure that the concerns that they have in terms of technical capacities, human capacities, are well reflected on the political decisions and in the policy and plans that we are organizing in our countries. And last but not least, another way is on advocate. So really, you as a parliamentarians can play a role on advocating in the governments as the other power, not the executive power, but the legislative power, how we can really advocate for the government for shifting from an even central response and recovery approach to more disaster risk reductions on which one early warning systems are included and have a multi-hazard approach. That means changing this conception that we have, and notably on our Caribbean region, thinking that disaster risk reduction is only emergency preparedness. If we work with this continued vision that we focus only on preparing for the emergency, but we are not ensuring the substantial reduction of disaster risk, we are working only on 15% on what we should be doing to really reduce disasters, and we are not being cost effective. So if you see that the governments are really implementing policies or proposing legislation that are tackling only preparedness for emergencies, but not really reducing disaster risk, investing on that reduction is the way how we will need to ensure that you collaborate on advocating for a shift from an emergency to a disaster risk reduction approach. Also, on advocate that the data, expertise, and experience of national international agencies and institutions are really being shared, and that we can leverage to inform these multi-hazard early warning systems and disaster reduction frameworks with the data that is provided. Something that I mentioned before is really, you can really play a role on facilitating that institutions at the national level can share easily data and really can have a repository of data that is life to life and updated, and that come from all of the sectors of the government and all of the institutions, in order that these colleagues from the National Disaster Risk Management organizations can identify what information coming from gender bureaus, what information coming from the Minister of Health, what information coming from the Minister of Commerce, from the Minister of Economy, can be used for me to better understand what will be the impacts of a specific hazard, and try to transition early warning systems, providing more information, not only on the hazards, but on the impacts that hazards will cause. And for that, we will need the data. And last but not least, really on advocated that we will have a comprehensive climate and disaster risk management approach that consider multi-hazard early warning systems a key strategy for adaptation and preparedness. So that means that we really, as a parliamentarians, we will need to encourage that governments stop working in silos between the people that are working on the climate change agenda, on the disaster risk reduction agenda, on the sustainable development agenda, and understand that climate and adaptation and disaster risk reduction are key elements for ensuring prosperity in our countries, economic growth, and notably sustainable developments that will allow us really to ensure that we have effectiveness and sustainability on our approaches. One of the examples here is the recent example, and I'm very happy that the speaker from Trinidad and Tobago was mentioning it, about the National Adaptation Plan that was prepared in Trinidad and Tobago, and on which one, with the support of different colleagues of the UN, we have prepared an annex to be submitted by Trinidad and Tobago, and that has been validated by OIDPEM, so the National Disaster Risk Management Organization, Trinidad and Tobago, and the Minister of Planning and Development as the key actor on the National Adaptation Plan, to ensure that this National Adaptation Plan was retrofit with a vision of disaster risk reduction, and that that vision of disaster risk reduction also incorporate multi-hazard early warning systems. Last but not least, I wanted to leave you with this specific quote from Amina Mohammed, our Deputy Secretary General, on which one she's mentioned that every person in the Caribbean, in every single seat and in the world, must be protected by an effective multi-hazard early warning systems. Today, with the technology that we have, with the democracy that we have, with our political systems, with all of the information that we have, and the new information that is coming, like the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, etc., this is not a privilege to have early warning systems in our countries, but it's a right to everyone. Thank you for your attention, and I'm ready to take any question that you may have concerning these presentations. Over to you, Madam Chairman.
Well, thank you very much for that presentation. I must say, I didn't know some of those points were very good and very knowledgeable. I like the point that natural disaster is a thing of the past. We must know that all disasters aren't natural. And then that we must ensure we have clear legislation and a multi-sector strategies that create incentives and inclusive of vulnerable populations. We thank you very much. Up next, before we go to the question and answer period, because we want out 2 speakers, before we go to the questions, I'd like to introduce the second speaker, and then we'll have our questions. So please, if you're on, write down your questions so we can ensure that you have them for each speaker. So our next speaker, Tony Broadbrayer, is a representative of the UN Women Multicultural Office for the Caribbean, presenting on better practices and lessons learned in inclusive disaster risk management. So she's a representative of the UN Women Multicultural Office for the Caribbean. She has extensive experience in gender justice and development, having served in various roles with UN Women and UNDP across the Caribbean, Pacific, and South Africa. Mrs. Broadbrayer holds degrees from the University of West Indies, the London School of Economics, and ESADE Business School. Let's again welcome virtually with those hand clapping emojis.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Really appreciate it, and always a pleasure to be in these kinds of sessions. So I'll be picking up exactly where Jair dropped off in terms of the importance of, one, ensuring, and it was something that was repeated by Senator Hepburn Forbes, is the notion that we don't have to have disasters. We are in a hurricane zone. So the fact that we actually have hurricanes or flooding or things like that, that's natural, but that's a hazard. What makes it a disaster is whether we have put things in place effectively or not. And so I'm going to be talking about better practices and lessons learned in inclusive disaster risk management. So the level of risk and whether a hazard becomes a disaster or not depends on many things. Your
Sorry,
geographical
Tanya.
location. Hello?
We're seeing your presentation notes and not the presentation.
Oh, I don't know why. Let me share again. I should be better at this after, we've had such a long time of Zoom. Can you see the presentation now?
Yes.
Wonderful, thank you. So we're looking at geographical location, livelihood reliance on the environment, the exposure to the consequences of climate change, vulnerabilities, which we'll get into more, the type of hazard that we experience, as well as sex, gender, age, disability, ethnicity, and sexuality. We had a conversation previously with judicial officers discussing the difference between risk and vulnerability. In our region, there's always a pushback. Why are we speaking about gender? Often because persons think gender equates women. We have a lot to unpack there, but we won't do that right now. When we speak about risk and vulnerability, and that vulnerability that we speak to in terms of whether a hazard really is going to manifest itself in the form of disaster for certain people, is because of an understanding of what makes people vulnerable and who is most marginalized. And generally, if we look at the definitions of vulnerability and marginalization, there's certain groups that experience more marginalization and vulnerability because of their ability to adapt, cope, or deal with the impacts of external shocks. Also, their ability to access what their community, their national framework has in terms of assets or systems and services. So to be clear, when we're speaking about sex, we're speaking about a person's biological and physical characteristics that are inherited or determined at birth. In the world, although there are two sexes identified on this particular slide, because these are the two sexes we know most, female and male, there are persons who are intersex, and it is biological. And every time there's an Olympics, we hear more and more about this because many people don't know that they're intersex, but it is a reality. Gender, though, is referring to the social, cultural, power dynamics and emotional and behavioral differences between those who we consider to be men and women, generally because of sex, male and female. Gender identity and sexual orientation are connected, but they are not only relevant to issues of gender equality and gender equity. When we're talking about vulnerability and risk, though, we need to understand how does sex, how does class, ethnicity, age, race, ability, disability, sexual orientation, and gender identity affect a human being's ability to manage a natural hazard. We speak often about resilience. The things that make people resilient are the opportunities to be able to escape vulnerability and be less marginalized. So what is it that parliamentarians do, and how do we see parliamentarians really playing a key role in developing a framework at the national level that moves beyond an understanding of everybody should get the same thing regardless of how they're moving through this world based on their sex, their class, their age, their ability or disability, or their race, towards not only equity, but looking at moving towards a systemic transformational change. So in this case, we had CPL happening recently in the Caribbean. We're moving from a fence to a chain link fence, a wooden fence to a chain link fence, because the issue is not the person's capacities. It's actually what is preventing them from having access to whatever the services are that they need. We also see parliamentarians in their roles as oversight, budgetary oversight, accountability, and legislation or decision making. We look at them as being able to ensure that persons are empowered. Understanding where the barriers have been so that what is making persons more vulnerable, what is making persons more marginalized, and creating opportunities towards what is defined as empowerment. And that may mean different things for different people. Maria, did you switch to yours?
Yes, I did. Just because we couldn't see the slides going, so
I'm so sorry, colleagues.
Don't worry.
Not sure what's happening with my computer. Okay, so the next slide, please. These are the components of what many people feel to be empowerment. And this has been pulled together by various UN agencies and other organizations. The ability to have access to resources, dignity, social protections, access to justice, a skill set that is valued, agency, and the ability to make decisions. When we have natural hazards, what generally happens immediately is that the things that define our humanity are often gone. Our homes, our devices, in terms of, I remember one parliamentarian, actually, I believe she recently passed, a former Speaker of the House in Dominica, was speaking about in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, the fact that everyone was asking her to be resilient, but there was a lot of dignity in her clothes and in her shoes, and that had washed away. So understanding that these are parts of the elements of what make human beings feel the most human, and these are often the most at risk during a natural hazard. Your access to social protection, your access to justice, resources, your ability to make decisions, and how you can best apply your skill set. Next slide, please, Maria. So we know, and I think Jair did an excellent job of speaking about the way in which we need to ensure parliamentarians advocate. We need to look at legislation, ensuring that pre-disaster and planning, there's legislation and laws that do the best possible to mitigate against the worst outcomes of a potential hazard. And we'll get into some detail about what that could be. And Jair has also given an example of the early warning systems. Preparedness, advocating for and supporting the budget use for relief efforts, and not just after, but we know hurricanes come every year. We know flooding happens every year. How can the budget be in place for gender responsive relief efforts as well? Understanding how people, again, are navigating their communities in the world. The debating. What are the important issues of the day throughout, especially as it comes to response and relief? What is being prioritized when we look at the ways in which we are using social protection to respond, and what is being prioritized when we're looking at economic empowerment to respond to the aftermath of a natural hazard? Budgeting and taxation, checking and approving not only the government spending, but encouraging private sector partners who may be contributing to the impacts of climate change. And of course, we know our region, at least the Caribbean region, is contributing minusculely to this. But still, if there is anything, making sure that taxation is used as a negative incentive for those who are contributing. Scrutiny, really checking and challenging the work so that we're accountable, not opposing just to oppose, but definitely consistently ensuring that the best impact possible for the population is at the forefront of any kind of scrutiny that is happening. And then finally, in all of this, ensuring that the approval of the assessments and any plans for post-disaster needs are including where people are. And I'm saying where people are instead of gender, because sometimes I did the definitions to make sure no one got distracted. But this is about where are our girls, where are our boys, what is happening to women, and what is happening to men. And I'll get into some detail into that. But this is generally just a slide to show you the cycle of disaster management and preparedness, and where we see the role of parliaments in ensuring that at each stage, there is a role and action to mitigate, ensure that there's preparedness, effective response and relief, as well as rehabilitation and reconstruction. Next slide, please, Maria. I just wanted to go through these very quickly, because if we're going to have evidence-based legislation, evidence-based policy, evidence-based budgeting, we need to know where women and men are in our societies. We know at this stage, especially as it pertains to social protection and what happens before and after a hurricane, those providing the care for the most vulnerable, the elderly and children, are women. Next slide, please. With that in mind, and there's other data at the end of my presentation, we know that 46% of women in the Caribbean who have ever been in a relationship have experienced some form of violence in their intimate partnership. We also know that this violence increases when there are external stresses. We know that only 8% of women are entrepreneurs in our region, and of that 8%, only 1% of them actually have employees. I'm giving all of these examples to show when a hazard happens, if a woman is affected and she's a business owner, the likelihood of her having, one, staff is minuscule, two, an opportunity to actually have time to work is minuscule because she'll be taking care of those who are most vulnerable to the impacts of a natural hazard at the time. So how can we make sure that we're looking at where those women are and where those men are? We have some details again about where men are and how men are affected by hazards. And that is also something that needs to be able to inform the way in which we legislate and support men in the aftermath of a hazard. In the Caribbean region, men are more likely to die in the aftermath of a hazard than anybody else because they are most likely to take risks to save property and people. So data and analysis is a better practice in the Caribbean for preparedness. Those countries that have completed studies so that they understand what the inequality of climate change and disaster risk in the Suriname, for example, are winning in terms of a better practice because they at least have the data and some analysis to be able to say what is happening to who, when, and why. Capacity building. Who is supposed to do what when? Now, it was fantastic to hear from Speaker Annisette-George about the progress being made in Trinidad and Tobago, especially because there's a specific disaster management agency in Trinidad and Tobago. Now, the role that the Red Cross, a civil society organization that plays a critical role in disaster response plays is critical, as well as understanding each agency, ministry, and department, better understanding what is our role and how are we best coordinated to be able to effectively and efficiently carry out these roles when we too may have been impacted by the hurricane is critical. So that's why you need the national action plans. Now we're moving to nationally determined contributions. How much do those plans speak to the other policies from every other agency, including the gender policies? Or are they siloed? We have some better practices of coordination in the Caribbean, but we need to make sure that that's something that Parliament in your scrutiny role does to make sure that all of the plans are in fact disaster resilient. Next slide, please. Grenada has an excellent better practice because they have a gender budget, for example. So they know what is going where and tracking to whom it goes to and why. We have done a lot of capacity strengthening trainings across all of those countries that you saw the maps of in the last slide on gender responsive climate budgeting in the Caribbean. But this is critical. And we say gender responsive, it's really just efficient budgeting, understanding why someone is getting funding or not. Next slide, please. Some other better practices in the early action stage. Some countries immediately reach out to SEDIMA and the UN for engagement and coordinated engagement. That's fantastic. We've seen other cases where persons are just landing in countries in the aftermath of a disaster and there's no coordination. So that coordinated early action response is critical. But when you include the national gender machinery, for example, in Antigua and Barbuda, as well as in Grenada, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines, then you're starting to get to some of the most marginalized, because a lot of the people who those organizations work with already have experienced some form of challenge in which they're already engaging with the state. So not only engaging the national gender machineries, but the relevant civil society organizations is a critical role in early action, utilizing local suppliers where possible, and regional suppliers where it's not for early response. There are a lot of packs that are being created dignity kits, hygiene kits, get the local economy restarted. This is something that happened in Antigua and Barbuda, Dominica, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and Grenada. Use the businesses in the country. And that's something that parliamentarians can support through policy guidance. May not necessarily be legislation, it's up to you, but ensuring that you don't just go far for what can be sourced close to the country. Next slide, please. Going as quickly as possible, because I know with all of that, I lost some time. Better practices in early action as well. If you've done the pre-work with regards to understanding who benefits from your social protection, then you have a more targeted and effective social protection response. And your population better understands why certain people are getting certain kinds of social protection support and others are not. Gender-aware beneficiary analyses had been completed in St. Lucia, Jamaica, and Grenada, as well as St. Vincent and the Grenadines before Hurricane Beryl hit. These were able to be shared immediately with our colleagues at WFP, who you'll hear from afterwards, and UNICEF, and the government, so they could better see who would need what kind of support. Getting that immediate self-care and psychosocial support responses for adults and children was critical. And an opportunity to activate an emergency response in gender-based violence referral pathways. This happened in Antigua and Barbuda, but you can only do this if you have an effective gender-based violence referral pathway. And there should be every kind of violence referral pathway so that you don't see a halt to access to justice in the aftermath of a natural hazard. Next slide, please. In the recovery and response, Trinidad and Tobago has an excellent better practice in that they already have the possibility for digital tracking of protection orders. So we will not find ourselves in a situation like one country did, where someone who had a protection order against them found themselves in the same shelter as the person who had the protection order out against the person. Luckily, that person raised their hand and said, I should not be here, and was able to be moved. But this is in protecting both the person who has the protection order and the person who put out the protection order. The job opportunities, looking at job opportunities beyond just construction to also care. There is an assumption that elderly women and women will just care for the children and the elderly, and there's no compensation. And many people lose their jobs during this time because they're caring for their children because the schools are closed. This is, if you're looking at the cash for work programs for construction, why not also care once you have the right kinds of policies and safeguards in place? Include the national gender machineries and the civil society organizations in the response. And it could also be your community departments or development agencies. When you're building back, don't just build back the same, try to build back equal and better as much as possible. Insist on sex disaggregated data consistently, and consistently highlight the mental health and well-being. We just came from a meeting talking about citizen security and the fact that there's the belief that after a disaster, you see an increase in crime and violence. Yes, but this might all be linked to these issues as well. Next slide, please. That's it from me. And I know we have a question and answer. I try to go as quickly as possible, Senator Hepburn-Forbes.
Well, thank you very much for that. I mean, I love the catch tag. When we build it back, we should not only build back better and do better. I think that was a lot for us to digest, and I'm going to just jump right in to the question and answer period. And this question is actually for both presenters. I'll let each of you answer this question before I open up the floor to other persons that may have questions. And the question reads as follows. What are the strategies to effectively incorporate the perspectives and contributions of local women and community-based organizations into DRR and resilience strategies? Do I need to repeat that again?
Sure, you can repeat it first, but I see Jair is passing the word to me.
Okay, so I'll repeat it and then you could start, and then I will ask one more question. I actually have two. I'm sorry. What are the strategies to effectively incorporate the perspectives and contributions of local women and community-based organizations into DRR and resilience strategies?
So I can start with some strategies that we have seen as a better practice. When you ensure that early on, the National Disaster Management Agency or organization works closely to, one, train some of these women to be focal points in their communities so that they are early warning systems in some place, that they are the ones who spread the word within their community. That's a better practice. Two, getting feedback from them about what has worked and what has not worked is always very important. But these kinds of consultations need to happen. Again, don't do it in hurricane season. You have to do it way before hurricane season. Have the consultations with them. Take that feedback back into the policies and plans and the better coordination, because they'll be the first to tell you that 5 different people came to ask them the same question 3 weeks after a hurricane passed through. And they will tell you who asked the right questions, when was the right time to come to ask the questions, and the kind of support that is generally needed for them to be able to continue caring for their families and maintain their livelihoods.
Yeah, and if you allow me to complement, Senator, I completely agree with Tony's answer. I think that the big issue here is really to ensure consultation, to ensure that we are really coming with the communities and understanding what are the different visions and problems that they have and trying to address them with them. There is this African phrase that I love very much that say, like, if you don't do it with us, you do it against us. And this is the thing here. If we really don't ensure consultations and trying to understand what are the visions, problems, also the perception that they have about risk, is very difficult to try to incorporate those elements and develop really strategies that are addressing the needs of these local communities, local women, and also others that are coming from, that have a particular vision, for instance, people with disabilities and that need to be listened and to be included on the policies that you will be developing. Over to you.
Okay, so thank you very much. I have one more question and I'm going to open up the floor. How can parliaments ensure that these contributions are recognized and integrated into national efforts to build disaster and climate resilience? I'll say it again. How can parliaments ensure that these contributions are recognized and integrated into national efforts to build disaster and climate resilience?
So I guess, Tony, this time I will start.
Please, can you, I'm not hearing you as well. I don't know if it's only me. I'm not sure if your mic is down.
Now, do you hear me better?
There you go.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. I think that the most important parliamentarians play a very important role on, on the aspects that I have presented before. The first one is on the legislation. And it's very important that all of these initiatives, that you do an assessment about how legislation is contributing to create a more resilient countries, more resilient communities, and really to integrate climate adaptation approaches and disaster risk reduction approaches on the whole sustainable elements. If we don't have legislation, normally what we have realized is when the legislation is not there, this is not a priority for the country. And you will see that priorities of the country are normally discussed in December when the Minister of Finance are checking what is in policy and what he needs to put in the budget for the next year or for the next years. He see what has been already agreed by the Parliament and what has been already agreed in policy. If it's not in policy, it's not a priority. Becomes another item in the whole list of different institutional and governmental agencies requesting for promoting these elements, for instance, of early warning systems. So the first one is really to assess if we have the necessary legislation and policy for promoting disaster risk reduction, for promoting climate change adaptation, for integrating these topics on the whole planning of the development of the country. And second, the advocate elements that we have mentioned, like you have the elements of advocating for these elements, but as well you have the elements of oversight, really ensuring the political control that you provide to the institutions that have the responsibilities of disaster risk management and of climate change adaptation to ensure that they are doing the job, and they are doing the job with a holistic and comprehensive vision and not only focus on one part of the whole elements of disaster risk reduction. It's not only about being prepared for the emergency, as I have previously mentioned, but really ensuring that we are substantially reducing the risk of hazards becoming disasters in our country. Over to you, Tony.
Thanks. So I'm looking, I'm not going to share my screen because the screen was revolting against me, but that circular one that I had, and I'll make sure that the presentation is shared, that looked at the different aspects of comprehensive disaster management and the different ways in which the parliaments can integrate and ensure that they're supporting. So as Jair said, the legislation, and it goes beyond the disaster management acts, which do need to be updated and reformed, but it also looks at every other act, especially the acts around access to justice and social protection, ensuring that those acts have disaster kind of resilience options within them, so that you don't need to be recreating something or the real, but that you understand that the region you're in and the country you're in is one that is prone to hazards. And so these acts also know how actions should shift when there is a disaster, when there's a hazard, so that there's not a disaster. Also, when you're doing the scrutiny of any bill that comes before you, ensuring that there's resilience integrated into these bills. So whether it's the Police Service Act or another relevant act, how can you make sure that these different acts are as disaster responsive as possible? And then again, with the budgeting and the taxation, always having, again, a little bit put aside for the fact that there will need to be an effective response to this. How do we integrate that effective response clearly? One other thing I just wanted to say quickly, and this is why the Education Act is one that would have to be looked at as well. Most of our shelters in the Caribbean are schools still. And we don't have long-term shelters, we have short-term shelters. And what has happened in most of the countries that have experienced recently a very strong hurricane is that the schools that those shelters are in are closed for months on end. And then Parliament is trying to figure out what to do. Figure out ahead of time how you can best address these issues, because it is not an issue of God being a citizen of one of our countries. It is an issue of this is a reality of our space, and we do need to make sure that we are as prepared as possible.
Okay, thank you. I think they were salient points. I'm now going to open up the floor for questions. Are there any questions from the floor?
Yes, hello. Hello to everyone. With regard to the early warning systems, I know a lot of focus is on technology, but as one of the speakers there mentioned about the social aspect. And I always remember a story from schoolhood days of the boy who cried wolf. Eventually, nobody believed him. And I think with regards to the public, the credibility of early warning systems in terms of acceptance by the public is exceedingly important, because they are the ones who have to respond to all of these warning systems. So what are the best practices to bring about enhancing the credibility of early warning systems amongst members of the public?
Thank you, Honorable Parliamentarian Timal. I think that you have put a question that is very particular, that is about the false alerts or the false warnings. This is something that normally when we are establishing these systems will happen because, as you have mentioned, we are here depending a lot of technology, and we are also depending here as well with something that we need to be transparent to the public, that is uncertainty. We have uncertainty when we are doing the monitoring and the forecasting of the different hazards, notably, for instance, hurricanes or earthquakes or different hazards that can impact our countries, we have a lot of uncertainty. And it's very important that since the beginning, we will be very transparent and inform our populations about that uncertainty and about the possibility that we can have false alerts or false warnings. Transparency and information to our constituents, our citizens, will help us to get the trust that is one of the most important elements on disaster risk reduction and on the implementation of early warning systems. I always put the example, for instance, in the COVID pandemic, there were a lot of misinformation and information coming all around, like if you have to wear the mask or you don't have to wear the mask. And I remember, for instance, the Prime Minister, the President of France, saying to the public that masks were not necessary. And after 15 days, changing the discourse to say like, yeah, masks are necessary. So that creating this confusion between the public put a lot of, a lack of trust on the authorities. And it would have been better, one of the lessons that many of the practitioners we have on that, like it would have been better if the president would have stated that there is an uncertainty about if to wear or not to wear the mask and a recommendation on the no regrets approach to say like, I prefer that everybody will use the mask, but we don't know if it's going to be positive or negative. So one of the big recommendations when using these specific systems and really ensuring that we have the trust of our populations is being transparent and also informing about the uncertainties that we have on this natural process on which one we don't have control. We have a lot of investments on monitoring, on forecasting, on knowing how, what are the risks, what are the exposure, what are the vulnerabilities. Nevertheless, we have a lot of uncertainty still. And we need to communicate this to the public in order to create the trust that the systems require in order to be effective.
Thank you.
Over to you.
Are there any other questions? We had a really exciting panel. Okay, go ahead.
Hi, President. Good afternoon. Dr. Rai Radburn, Member of Parliament for Komoto Manzanilla. My constituency is based on the eastern border of the Trinidad. And in times of hurricanes or bad weather, we are the first to receive that Atlantic horrible disaster in terms of bad winds and floods that will follow. And the constituency from Tobago going on straight down to Beach, I know many of you will not know the area that I'm speaking about, is rugged terrain. And what I have to look at and what we need to look at as a country and as a Caribbean nation, that the vulnerable areas, these areas are maroon. We need training for those people who live in that area because you can't go through the floods to access them. So training for the communities so that they can become resilient in basic medical resources and foods and whatever emergency supplies. And that is an important thing with climate change. You're going to have more and more people maroon and we can't get to them. And that is something that we need to look at. Enhance training for these communities and villages in rural communities. Thank you.
I definitely agree. And as a member of the Red Cross, I know we also do things with community disaster risk. And I think what was stated earlier by one of our presenters, Torres, is ensuring that we know everybody knows their roles and work together. Do we have any other questions?
Senator Hepburn, I just wanted to add one thing to that because we did have a direct experience of a very vulnerable area in one of the Caribbean countries being affected, and persons were allowed to build in certain ways that made them even more vulnerable. And they weren't able to get insurance. And many of these homes were also where people had their businesses. So there should be some guidance for these communities as to what are better building practices within these spaces, as well. And that's something that Parliament can also look into around urban planning and legislation around those things, but also giving guidance to the communities and the insurers, because then this becomes a bigger impact on the state around how they can effectively ensure if people build best according to plan. But of course, the training needs to happen. It's just there's some things that training can never assist with if you build poorly in these kinds of areas. And I do know that area from Toko, it can become even more difficult for you to be able to manage the impacts of a hazard.
Well, thank you. And again, round of applause. But we have two new speakers coming up, Nicholas Gaynor and Cristobal Lopez Marcel. So Nicholas Gaynor is from the World Food Program and will discuss linking shock responsive social protection to disaster risk financing, lessons from the ground in response to disasters. And he works as a program policy officer for disaster risk management for the World Food Program. He is an experienced professional in the financial services industry, specializing in risk management and compliance. He has a strong background in regulatory affairs and has held various leadership roles, demonstrating expertise in developing climate change action plans and disaster risk management plans, and providing risk modeling assessments. Thank you very much. Virtual round of applause.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. So again, I know in the interest of time, I will look to get into my presentation. So my name is Nick Granger. I'm from the World Food Program Caribbean Multi-Country Office. And today, as the presentation has mentioned, what I will do is speak on the work that we are doing in the region in terms of linking different risk finance instruments, again, to national social protection systems. For us in the World Food Program, we support governments in strengthening their national systems that they can better prepare for, adapt to, and respond to shocks, and in particular climate hazards as well, but also different types of disasters. But within that collaboration with governments, one of the main focuses is again looking at using social protection systems to make them what we call more shock responsive. How do we work with governments in a way that these social protection systems can be strengthened in such a way that they can allow for rapid scaling up to ensure that vulnerable populations, again, can be safeguarded in response? So the question is, what is shock responsive social protection? And again, existing social protection systems and programs, they can contribute to preparing for and responding to shocks that impact many people at once. And these shocks can be natural, social, economic, political, or environmental. And for a social protection system to be more shock responsive, you want to ensure that, there's continuity in the aftermath of a large-scale shock, that there is the ability for these systems to absorb additional demand for benefits and services, but most importantly, how can we mitigate the negative impact faced by vulnerable populations? How can we prevent persons from going into their savings to ensure that, dipping into their savings in response to shocks, but also how can we ensure that development gains also are protected as you start to move into the recovery phase? So for shock responsive social protection, again, we as the World Food Program, we speak about it. And while shock responsive social protection is a fairly relatively new terminology, I would say, that has been coined, the World Bank referred to it also as adaptive social protection. I will say that in the Caribbean, they have been using social protection to respond for shocks for a number of decades. So this slide basically shows that as far back as 2004 with Hurricane Ivan, again, the government of Grenada would have used their social protection systems to provide support to those who were impacted. But also, you will also see an example of the different types of shocks as well that governments across the region have used over the years. For example, the global financial crisis, as I mentioned, economic shocks. But we saw with the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a surge or increase, right? A further momentum for evaluating and strengthening the links between disaster management and social protection, and ensuring that adequate and predictable financing could be in place to provide critical support to vulnerable people. So when we're working on shock response and social protection, what we try to look at is the different pathways, as we call it, as regards to shock response and social protection. How can we use these 6 pathways to prepare systems for response? So the 6 are institutions, information management, targeting, delivery mechanisms, coordination, and last but not least, financing. In terms of policy legislation, Tony would have touched on it or mentioned it earlier. How do we ensure that the responsive role of social protection is integrated with policies and strategies and procedures and vice versa? So how do we ensure that disaster management acts also speak to the need for social protection and vulnerable populations, but also how can social protection policies make mention of disaster risk management as well as the climate crisis? Information management. How do we strengthen information management systems to have relevant and accessible and current data on vulnerable populations? How do we ensure also that we know who are the most vulnerable populations and where they are and where they're located? And that's why we also want to make sure that we can adopt targeting processes to identify people who are vulnerable to and impacted by shocks and disasters. Delivery mechanisms. We've worked with governments to, again, tailor different payment mechanisms for scaling up so that people can be quickly onboarded to existing or alternative delivery systems for social protection programs. So, for example, in Belize, we would have tested the use of mobile wallets to deliver cash assistance to impacted persons after Hurricane Lisa, but also we have worked with governments either with the delivery of cash and envelope to impacted beneficiaries due to the COVID-19 pandemic, or direct payments to their bank accounts. So it's really looking at the most efficient and the quickest way to get assistance to those who need it most, but also recognizing the need for a balance to consider things such as gender, in terms of the elderly, the persons with disabilities, and some of the constraints and limitations that they can face depending on the type of delivery mechanisms that can be chosen. Both Jair and Tony also would have spoke about coordination. How do we ensure there's better coordination between different stakeholders as it relates to disaster management and social protection? What we have been trying to do as well is bring together, in particular, the disaster management agencies and the social protection ministries across the Caribbean to strengthen a lot of this engagement, not only at the time of a shock, but, for example, with hurricane season, to have this engagement at the beginning of the year to start some of these preparation processes, to ensure that you start discussions around the type of assessment tools that can be used. So just as Tony mentioned, that when the response is activated, again, persons who were impacted are not being overloaded with surveys from different people who are requesting the same information. But it's also recognizing that social protection is cross-cutting, not only with regards to disaster management, but again, different ministries such as education, such as health, and the need to understand what is going on in these different ministries in terms of development, but more importantly, how they can collaborate and work closer together to strengthen resilience as it relates to different shocks. So we as WFP, again, would have been supporting governments in strengthening their national social protection systems, but out of the 6 components of the pathways that I mentioned earlier, we found that financing was the one where we wanted to see how we can do a lot more. We wanted to ensure that we could allocate predictive and adequate financing that can be used to make sure that social protection systems can be strengthened, but also that the most vulnerable can be protected. So we launched our disaster financing strategy in 2020, and they have 2 pillars. And the first is advocacy, where we partner with governments to ensure that their national disaster risk finance portfolios take a holistic and risk-layered approach and also consider the need of the vulnerable and social protection. And when we speak of risk-layered approaches, what we mean is recognizing that there are different disaster risk finance instruments which are being used, both regionally and at the national level, but recognizing that each instrument, or one instrument rather, cannot be used to address the impacts or the varying impacts of different risks. So some instruments, for example, are better suited for those large hurricanes and earthquakes, which don't occur frequently, but when they occur, they cause nationwide and national damage. But then there are instruments which need to be tailored towards more localized events. So those trough systems which have the ability to dump a lot of rainfall within a short space of time, which can cause flooding to local communities, but also disrupt livelihoods and cause damage in the process. So as part of the advocacy, we try to do a mapping of the risk financing knowledge and capacities of the stakeholders within social protection, but again, also the other ministries such as health and environment, just to make sure that everybody has an understanding of the type of instruments which are being piloted and used in the region and how it could benefit, again, the social protection sector. We also facilitate training with regards to risk financing, again, which brings together the social protection ministries and the ministries of finance to give the social protection ministries a better indication and insight into some of the decision-making processes that the ministries of finance need to take, both in preparation for and in response to a shock. But what I really want to speak on today is the second pillar, which is around action, where we have been looking at using different risk finance instruments to see how we can link them directly to social protection systems. And in particular, we have partnered with the government, we partnered with different governments across the region to see how, again, we could get this process going. So in 2021, we would have partnered with the government of the Commonwealth of Dominica and the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility to, again, implement the first pilot around linking disaster financing to social protection. The Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility is the world's first multi-country risk insurance pool. What it does is that the facility provides insurance coverage for the governments of the Caribbean against tropical cyclone or hurricane or wind, excess wind. They also provide coverage against earthquakes and excess rainfall. So each year at the beginning of the hurricane season, the countries meet with CRIF and they purchase their policies, which have to be in place by June 1st. And what we at WFP wanted to do is to see how, again, we could bring this facility a lot closer to, again, meeting the needs of those vulnerable populations when impacted by a shock. And the reason we chose CRIF, for example, is that, again, we wanted to use an instrument that can be used to protect populations against those large-scale events that I mentioned, so Category 3, Category 4 hurricane. But also we wanted a facility that could ensure rapid disbursement of funds as well in the aftermath of a shock. So for example, with CRIF, once a country is impacted and the policy triggers, the government receives the financing from the facility within 14 days after the event. And the difference between CRIF and other insurance companies is that it's not based on a damage assessment for the payout to be released. The payout is actually based on, again, an analysis of the potential impact of a storm of a certain magnitude impacting a country. So for example, if a country buys coverage for a tropical cyclone policy where wind speed of a Category 3 storm is exceeded, it receives a payout. Once the wind speed exceeds a Category 3 storm, the government will receive a payout irrespective of the type of damage of which is on the ground. So as we work with the government of Dominica, we continue to support them on strengthening their information management systems, working with them on their targeting tools, delivery mechanisms, and better coordination with government ministries. And they were doing this work on their own as well before WFP arrived. So we have agreed with the government of Dominica from 2021 to increase the coverage under their CRIF policies. What this means is that we provide additional premium support, and should a policy trigger as a result of an impact of an event, a percentage of the payout is then earmarked to be used to deliver cash assistance to vulnerable populations through the national social protection systems. So for example, we may have increased the coverage of the policy in Dominica by 10%. So if the government gets a payout from the CRIF policy, then 10% of that overall payout then goes to the National Social Protection Program or National Social Protection Ministry, sorry, to deliver cash assistance to vulnerable populations. And as part of that, we also ensure that we work with governments to develop what we call a disbursement plan. And this disbursement plan captures processes and protocols from when the funds are released from CRIF to the government, in most cases the Ministry of Finance, but then how the funds are going to be channeled from the Ministry of Finance to the Social Protection Ministry, and then to the vulnerable populations who were impacted. This not only is done in a way that we could have a timeline to try to capture how each element of the process of implementing the cash assistance program could be captured, so that we can see an effective timeline to understand the efficiency of delivering cash in the aftermath of the event. But more importantly, it's also to identify who are the key stakeholders, both within government and also, again, external stakeholders who provide support to these programs, and what are their roles in dispersing cash and supporting the disbursement of cash to impacted populations. So we would have started with Government of Dominica in 2021, and as at 2024, we now have 7 countries which have adopted this model, included the 3 countries which were impacted by Hurricane Beryl, which are the Government of Jamaica, the Government of Grenada, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And what this slide is going to speak to in terms of lessons learned, we're now in the early days, but we would have invested with support from the Global Affairs Canada, $100,000 US to increase the coverage of the tropical cyclone policy for the Government of Grenada. As a result of that increase, the government would have had, again, a percentage of 10% of any CRIF payout being allocated for social protection. So as a result of the impact of Hurricane Beryl, the Government of Grenada would have received from CRIF roughly about 44 million, which means that of that 44 million, roughly $4.4 million US had now been allocated to the government to deliver cash assistance to vulnerable populations through the existing social protection systems. And this program is called the Beryl Relief Income Support Program, and it aims to provide income support to households whose source of income were affected by Hurricane Beryl, but also mainly in the islands of Carriacou, Petite Martinique, and the northern districts of Grenada. And this income support is tailored to meet households' monthly basic needs, fostering self-recovery while supporting the local economic activity and reducing the likelihood of migration. And where we at the WFP, where we provide support in this case, is that we work with the government throughout the project cycle as it relates to launching the cash assistance program. So we are there in terms of ensuring that they are receiving support around developing assessment forms, but not only in terms of having the assessment forms being ready to launch as quickly as possible, but also incorporating digitization with regards to some of these assessment forms that the governments will be using. How do we ensure that targeting mechanisms which are in place really ensure that those who need the assistance the most will indeed receive and will be identified to receive the support that they need. But most importantly, how can we also have transfers and reconciliation processes in place that can be completed as quickly as possible and ensure for a very efficient response. So our role at WFP is mainly to, again, support the government in ensuring that, again, a timely delivery of assistance to those who are impacted, but also recognizing the need that by strengthening systems in these programs in the aftermath of a shock, it also provides opportunities such as BRIF to implement different levels of innovation within their program that can allow for a change in terms of how they administer their social protection programs at the national level. So what are some of the proposed actions that we recommend usually for governments? And a lot of it are activities that, again, independent of WFP, that is the direction that governments have been going. So we encourage investment in shock response systems, integrating digital transformation, economic empowerment, and disaster financing. I mentioned that we have been using insurance as a tool of choice at the moment, but also, as Jerry would have mentioned, in terms of the need for anticipatory action. So with the government of St. Lucia, we are also looking to pilot how we can have an anticipatory action mechanism in place where financing is delivered to persons through the national social protection systems ahead of a storm, that they can implement preparedness measures in an attempt to reduce the impact of the storm as it approaches. How can we advocate to focus on scalable systems to make sure that improved data management that's in place, and also that sustainable financing is also an opportunity for the government. And again, while we talk about topping up the policies for CRIF and providing additional resources, we do recognize that governments of the Caribbean also have limited fiscal capacity as well in some cases to allocate, say, an additional $100,000 to increase the coverage under a policy. But it's not only about increasing the coverage, it's also about letting governments understand the need for identifying how to use funds before the country is actually impacted by a disaster. So if they want to, again, allocate 10% of the payout maybe towards social protection and maybe 15% towards the health sector, but then revisit how the funds can be allocated or how they were predetermined after, again, the shock has occurred and the extent of the damage had been evaluated. Promote knowledge sharing among governments to establish regional platforms for continuous learning. Again, reaching out to our neighbors across the sea to understand, what are some of the innovative solutions that they have in place. The government of St. Lucia would have gone to the Dominican Republic, where they would have gotten the inspiration to pilot a vulnerability index in response to Hurricane Elsa a couple of years ago. So they would have learned from the Social Protection Ministry in the Dominican Republic what are some of the key components that would have been needed for their vulnerability index, and they would have designed and developed one to be piloted specifically for Hurricane Lisa, but is now being re-evaluated to see how it can be integrated to be used for different types of shocks. Aligning social protection with broader disaster strategies to enhance resilience at both the community and national levels. And last but not least, design inclusive systems that cater to all vulnerable groups, including non-nationals, and prioritize economic empowerment to mitigate long-term vulnerabilities. How do we ensure those who, after an event, may not receive any support from national programs or who may have fallen through the cracks, to ensure that they can receive the assistance and have the ability to meet their basic needs? But also, how can we, again, ensure that we can address the issues of long-term vulnerabilities and allow persons to be empowered not only through receiving cash assistance, but receiving, again, capacity development and increasing skills that would allow them to build their resilience in response to shocks. Thank you very much. And any questions?
In the essence of time, we will do the question and answer period together. I'd like to introduce the next speaker and remind everyone to please write down your questions so when we open up the floor for questions and answers. Our next speaker is Cristobal Lopez Maciel from the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction and will present on resilient infrastructure, the urgency from legislation and institutional architecture to cope with climate change and disasters. He has 6 years of experience in urban development, focusing on promoting resilience and disaster risk reduction. Since 2020, he has coordinated the implementation of the Trinidad framework in Latin America and the Caribbean, developing tools for risk analysis and resilience governance. He has also worked on updating DRR plans and improving access to financial and international cooperation resources. Additionally, he has been involved in the design and supervision of critical infrastructure projects in areas such as education, health, and housing, aiming to support vulnerable communities. Please, virtual round of applause.
Thank you very much. Can you confirm if you can hear me well, please?
Confirmed.
Okay, and also, can you see the whole screen? Full screen?
Yes.
Yes, perfect. Okay, well, thank you very much, Honorable Senator, for that introduction. Well, I'm going to try to be brief as well, so don't take much of your time, but also I think it's an important or it's a critical topic, so I will try to stop in certain topics that might be interesting for you. So I'm going to start. First of all, you can take out your cell phone and you can scan the QR code. I think it might be useful for everyone's, given that the picture is not dynamic. and you cannot find the whole information that this picture displays. So the first question the first thing is like the question, what are the economical losses when when a disaster impacts? So this is a question that raised the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, CDRI. So they developed the GIRI index, which is the Global Infrastructure Risk Model and Resilience Index. So in that index, what they developed was the average annual losses. But the question is, what is the average annual losses? Well, it's the estimate average monetary losses that a country might expect to face annually. So basically what it is that they analyze historical and hazard data, vulnerability of the country's exposure of the infrastructure. They run this analysis and they identify and they created this probabilistic risk assessment. So basically what it says is that every year, what is expected or probabilistically expected economical losses that are going to happen each of the years according to each of the hazards. For example, we have for tropical cyclones, we run this analysis for the 13 countries here, and it is expected that every year, or there's the probability that every year is going to be spent 1,077 million of US dollars in recovery of the infrastructure impacted by tropical cyclones. The same is going to be, for example, with floods that might reach 173.9 million of US dollars. That's going to be affecting the infrastructure in these countries. So what I invite you is you can check this data because it might be really important for you and for the decisions you might take. Also, it is important that when we speak about economical losses, every dollar that is spent in recovery, is $1 not spending in development. So for each dollar that is not spent in recovery is not spending in development. For example, let's put it as an example a school. So when we invest $1, for example, recovering that school is not $1 investing in education. On the other hand, there are several studies that shows that every dollar spent in disaster risk reduction, it means from $4 to $7 equals to $4 to $7 spent in recovery. So with this, it's important to acknowledge the importance of disaster risk reduction strategies. Again, when we're speaking about disaster risk reduction, what does actually mean? Well, when we advance in disaster risk reduction, we advance in reducing disaster mortality. We advance in reducing the number of affected people. We advance in reducing the direct economic losses. And of course, we advance in reducing disaster damage to critical infrastructure and disruption of basic services. And this is important about the services, because when we speak about resilient infrastructure, we're not just speaking about the concrete walls, the 4 concrete walls around us. We're also speaking about the continuity and adaptability of our critical infrastructure so they can serve. So for example, a school is not only about the school, about the walls. It's also about the service, the critical service that they provide, which might be education, housing, for example, or for example, water treatment. It's delivering a service, and that's important to understand. When we're speaking about resilience infrastructure, we're speaking about the service also that this infrastructure is delivering. But also it's important to understand that we are a system of systems. And this is important because it's going to be interconnected. Jair also bring it when he was speaking about the early warning system, the multi-hazard early warning system, and how the hazard, the multi-hazard is affecting. But also we must to think about system solutions. For example, when we're thinking about resilient infrastructure system, we are ensuring that critical services do not stop, protecting both society and environment. But now we're gonna to understand, okay, what is a resilient infrastructure? So again, I invite you to take out your cell phone and you can scan this QR code so you can find out more about these principles for resilient infrastructure. And we develop these principles. So we must, again, we are understanding that when we're speaking of resilient infrastructure, we're also speaking about a diversity of things, not only about the walls, the concrete, the steel, but also how it's integrating into our societies. Thus, we develop these 6 principles. The first one is speaking about continuously learning. So the idea of this continuous learning is basically to understand what is happening, like why a disaster impacted and why the infrastructure couldn't resist, for example. But also what is more important is once we have the information that is going to happen, how we can design our infrastructure to resist, to absorb, and to transform. So a hazard is not becoming a disaster and just remains as a hazard. So then we have the information, we have the second principle, which is proactively protected. This means that, okay, we have the information, we have the knowledge, we develop the knowledge, okay, let's put it in practice, let's put it in place. So what we're trying to say with this principle is to proactively plan, design, build, and very important, to operate infrastructure. It's not only, again, it's not only about the walls, but also how this infrastructure is operated. Then, when we're speaking about infrastructure, also it's really important, or development per se, it's really important, the principle environmentally integrated. Why? Because when we're trying also to develop, or when we try to put in practice, to take actions into disaster risk reduction, if we're not integrating environmental approaches, we might be also creating risk. So this is also important, to be positively integrating with the natural environmental. The fourth one is the social engage. Of course, it's always important to bring the society. There should be different roles when we're speaking about society. It could be about engagement, it could be involvement, it could be participation, but also it can be to inform. Because sometimes what it happens is that we develop certain projects, certain infrastructure, but we're not consultant the society. Then we don't really know if those are the needs that they should be covered. And then the fifth one is shared responsibility. The Sendai framework has established it very clear. The responsibility for disaster reduction is a shared responsibility. Everyone should take action, and everyone has a responsibility to go there. And lastly, when we have all of these principles, of course, is to take in a step to action, to transform it. So it's not only learning, it's not only about implementing, but it's also to understand, to engage with everyone. Everyone should be responsible, and then we should move forward to the transformation. And lastly, I'm going to bring some of the key messages that should take into consideration. The first one, in the latest years, we have seen the resilience of critical services provided by national infrastructure has never been more important. We have seen so many, in so many occasions, the losses in different ways, in society losses, like livelihoods, economical losses. So it's really important to invest, as it was previously mentioned, to invest into resilience. There is a strong evidence that investment into infrastructure, into the resilience of the infrastructure, is economically justified. As I was mentioning, for every dollar that is spent into disaster risk reduction strategies is $1 that should not be invested, or $4 that should not be invested in recovery. But also, it's really important, and I take it with the next one, it's really important to move forward from words into action. It's not only about mention. It's not only about this to say it. We say it in Spanish. We have this saying, like saying to the four winds, like to say it to the whole direction. It's also important to take into the action. And for that, this is a great opportunity to advance from risk-informed information into this decision-making. So I think one of the cores of the whole the four presentation is that advancing for taking decisions, not only allocating the resources, but those allocations of the resources should be informed by risk analysis, informed for the population, informed for historically resources. So with that, I end my presentation. I try to be as quick as possible to not take in much of your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We appreciate that. Now is the time to open the floor for questions for any of our speakers. Please just raise your hand and let us know if you have a question.
Senator, I'm not seeing any hands raised. I will admit we are past our time as well. So it could be just a feature of people have to get back to their other schedules.
Okay, so you guys are lucky. You get to sneak off without any questions, but it is time for us to open up for the panel discussion. So I'm just going to explain how this session will work and then see if, ask a few questions to the panelists and see if we could get some discussion engaged. So in this segment, we will allow parliamentarians and other invited stakeholders to ask questions to the experts, share their own case studies on disaster management, and engage in dialogue about the practices they have implemented to inclusively reduce disaster risks. It will also provide a platform for them to highlight their current work on the matter, as well as opportunities for other parliamentarian actions and identify where we need further support, so we could identify strategies to enhance disaster risk governance. So I'm going to start by asking a question to our experts that are still on. How can parliaments establish partnerships with your organizations in order to support their work? And how do your agencies collaborate to ensure national level support is efficient? There's a question for all the panelists, and I'm going to repeat it one more time. How can parliaments establish partnerships with your organizations in order to support their work? And how do your agencies collaborate to ensure national level support is efficient? We don't all have to jump at one time, but I do need an expert to answer me. Should I call names like class?
You know what? It could be, Senator. I do feel that I think it's because we are now going to be well over time that maybe, I don't know. I see, do any of our colleagues still have a chance to answer this one question? And then maybe we should just wrap up the meeting. We are already 10 minutes over time on the meeting.
Okay. And I think if we could go with just the last two speakers, if you could answer, because our first speakers had a good time and we could always catch up. I'm sure this information will be sent to us and the recording sent. So if our last two speakers could answer that and then we could conclude.
Sure, sorry. Could you repeat the question, please?
Not a problem. How can parliaments establish partnerships with your organizations in order to support our work? And how do your agencies collaborate to ensure national level support is efficient?
Okay, if I may start, Nicholas, is it okay for you? Yeah, so I think we have already established a good process. I mean, these sessions are really important also, not only in the way of sensitization, but also to deliver some information and share experiences. We have some experiences in the region here in Panama where we are trying to connect with other parliamentarians about trainings, and we're trying to be more practical and more action oriented with our recommendations with our suggestions. So that's one of the approaches we're taking. Also, we need to, at the end of the day, we need to receive also requests so we can advance on that. And also regarding like working with the countries, we have a good presence in the Caribbean through my colleague Jair Torres, who and his team, who is actually not anymore in the meeting, but we have a really good presence, and we have really interesting thematics also that might be interesting for each of the countries. We are working, for example, with different groups of countries as well, so we can approach the topic more cohesive and also multi-country with a multi-country approach.
And just to kind of add, I think Tony actually mentioned it in the chat that popped up, but for us as the World Food Program, again, and UN agencies, we do a lot of coordination through the Regional Coordinating Office, right? The RCO here, and that's mainly to ensure that there's no duplication of efforts, that there's collaboration, because we don't want to waste resources in terms of, again, duplication of efforts, but also recognizing that, you know, with some of our partners, that there's limited capacity. So you have to take a very strategic approach to work with them to ensure that they have the bandwidth to implement projects and programs. So I think that goes very well because, again, we meet pretty regularly pretty frequently through different groups. But again, most importantly, is having that open dialogue, understanding, you know, what each partner is doing within different countries across the region, and also seeing how we could, again, pool our resources and our expertise to collaborate with governments to move things forward. For us as WFP also, we work directly with governments, again, throughout the Caribbean. And again, our partnerships are mainly through the Social Protection Ministry, and we're guided by them accordingly in terms of other stakeholders on the ground that we can approach and work with as we move forward. In response to Hurricane Beryl, last but not least, we've been working a lot more closely with organizations such as the Red Cross, for example, for the distribution of assistance, where we are relying on not only the number of persons they have on the ground in countries where we're not present, but also, again, some of the monitoring and evaluation that's needed, on-site monitoring, post-distribution monitoring, that we don't have, again, enough capacity on the ground that they could supplement and help us move forward.
Well, thank you, everyone. The expert panelists were wonderful. And on this wonderful Wednesday, we thank everybody that took time out of their busy schedule to come and listen and learn. I know this information will be disseminated along with our group picture. And now I have the awesome task of turning the meeting back over to our MC.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Senator, for moderating those two panels. Super interesting dialogue. Look, we're moving fast here, but I have to say, it comes up in a lot of our meetings, and I do feel, so I have parliamentarians here to hear me, data, data, data. I don't know how parliaments can be more supportive in helping to break down the silos of how data is shared between ministries, truly, or to make sure that data is being desegregated and to make sure data is being collected. But it comes up in every topic, every meeting we have, is how important data is for evidence-based decision making. We know it. It feels like this is a space that we could see some real gains. And I guess I'm mindful because I just came out of a program with Caribbean colleagues on digital economy. And a big piece of that was the fact that we do have amazing tools now to create better digital infrastructures within governments around this data piece. So I'm really, well, look, I'm also saying here as a partner for ParlAmericas, if this is a space that we can be supportive in and trying to connect the dots on what this is how to get data, it just feels like it'll unlock so many opportunities for good policymaking, good legislation. To the question that our senator just asked too about the partners, but I am putting out there to our partners, you know that you have in ParlAmericas a willing ally and support to connect you with parliaments and parliaments that you have in ParlAmericas. Obviously it's your organization. Any way that we can support you in connecting with these experts. We actually just recently signed a memorandum of understanding we have many with different UN agencies, but they were very specifically on this notion of the resident coordinator's office. Like we have an MOU actually with the agency that kind of coordinates the resident coordinators, specifically because the UN has created this mechanism that allows for kind of a better coordination in each country. And they cleanly want to see a way or find a way how to connect parliaments with that resource. And so please, if you need any support in finding that information, feel free to contact us. And Tawny so kindly said in a chat to me on the side, they know how to reach UN Women. It's to work through ParlAmericas, and ParlAmericas and UN Women are like, we are family in the Caribbean. We work very hard together. Thank you, Tawny, as always, for your incredible support and collaboration in our work. We will have, I do need to say, we have an evaluation. I'm cognizant of time. It's very short. We are going to post it as a poll here. If you could do me the grand favor of just answering the three questions. It's in one language too, so it's even easy to read as opposed to some of our other meetings. That would be very helpful. In the interim, as you are doing so, it gives me great pleasure to officially help bring this meeting to a close, that I would like to invite Member of the National Assembly, Radjendrekoemar Debie. I get to call him Mr. Debie. That's easier. I'm sorry, sir, if I Radjendre, I think though, is I can shorten it, right? I think we were saying but Mr. Debie from Suriname, he's the Vice President representing South America for the ParlAmericas Parliamentary Network on Climate Change and Sustainability. And thank you so much, sir, for being here with us, even past time, to help bring some closing remarks to our session today here with our experts and parliamentarians. I pass the floor to you, sir.
Thank you, Alicia. Good afternoon, all. I extend my thanks to everyone who attended today's meeting and to our esteemed partners who have significantly contributed to expanding our understanding of the critical topic of disaster risk reduction. Yes, this session was born out of the expressed interest of the Caribbean parliamentary stakeholders with specialized knowledge on this topic, and it has certainly fulfilled that purpose. I hope we all feel better equipped to enhance our readiness for natural hazards and the impacts of climate change through our legislative oversight and the budgetary rules. Today, we have gained valuable insights into the tools and the partnership available to us, from building stronger infrastructure and multi-hazard early warning systems to ensuring our disaster management plans are exclusive and consider everyone's safety and needs, especially those of women and girls and vulnerable populations. We also learned about the importance of social protection, what effective response and relief, and how to ensure efficient resource delivery to the public during a disaster. With everything addressed today, it is clear that we as parliamentarians can act as a vital link between the government and the community, as well as ensure that our actions support the achievement of national commitments made to the Sendai framework and the other climate agreements. By doing this, we can help ensure disaster risk reduction is integrated into existing sectoral legislation and is accompanied by an inclusive and multi-sector consultation and coordination. Every sector faces some level of disaster risk, and for that reason, it is critical to obtain and request data from all sectors, not just the environmental sector, to understand individual and systemic risks. As earlier mentioned, disaster risk reduction and preparedness are priority of area for the action in the Caribbean. This due to the increasing intensity and frequency of natural hazards spurred by the impact of climate change. It is important to mention that early warning is a major element of disaster risk reduction. It can prevent loss of life and reduce the economic and material impacts of hazard events, including disasters. To be effective, early warning systems need to actively involve the people and communities at risk from a range of hazards, facilitate public education and awareness of risks, disseminate messages and warnings efficiently, and ensure that there is a constant state of preparedness and that early action is enabled. Disaster risk governance at the national level, regional, and global levels is of great importance for an effective and efficient management of disaster risks. In conclusion, let us continue to work collaboratively, leveraging the knowledge and partnership we have cultivated today to build a safer and more resilient future for all. Thank you once again for your participation and commitment. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Debie. Colleagues, the other piece here, just to say, and one, all of these materials that were shared today, presentations, we'll make sure that they get circulated. There will be a video from this session, so those members from your parliament who were unable to attend but would like to kind of gain from the insights that were shared here and these presentations, that video will also be made available. We got one comment too, and one of the pieces is, and I think it came up, it blew my mind, right, was this idea of an annual investment of USD 6 billion in DRR could generate a total risk reduction benefit of USD 360 billion. Like, it's mind blowing to think about the true opportunity. If you want to, even when it comes to convincing our governments, I mean, from Parliament, we're trying to say to government, this just, it's good math. It makes sense, let alone the lives, you know, saving the lives, safeguarding the livelihoods, that all is it's important, and it makes good sense. So it just feels like a disaster risk reduction, early warning system. If this is a space that we can continue to work with you all on at the parliaments, working with our, you know, to move forward on such an important area of work, we are here to work with you. I thank everyone for taking the time here today to come and spend this time. Again, I thank our experts for coming and sharing up their expertise. Senator Hepburn Forbes, thank you so much for moderating our sessions with us. Madam Speaker, for opening remarks, Mr. Debie for closing remarks, and all of the parliamentarians who joined in this session. Sincerely, all the very best from Ottawa. We look forward to continuing to work with you.